Good afternoon, everybody. Another sunny day, so there's clearly something about our lecture series that is inviting the sun, which is great. So like I said last week, well done for turning up when it's absolutely glorious outside. I highly recommend going and getting a pint afterwards. This is the third in our series of lectures this term, which is showcasing the newest of our research projects, all grouped under how we manage the global commons and our collective responsibility versus individual needs. Today we've got Malcolm McCulloch and Nick Eyre, who head up the Oxford Martin programme on integrating renewable energies, which is addressing the challenges that we face getting a good supply of renewable energy into mainstream energy grids. So I won't go on for too long with introductions, but just the normal housekeeping, please. If you could put your devices on silent. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag #SharedWorld. My colleague Caroline will be able to take questions by Twitter for those of you watching online. For those of you in the room, please do remember that this is being live webcast and filmed. So if you're not comfortable with your voice being recorded or streamed live, if you get somebody else to ask the questions for you. Thanks very much. Over to Nick and Malcolm.
Thanks, Carol. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So, as Carol said, this is in the series that's about how we address the balance between individual responsibilities and collective responsibilities. We're talking about whether renewable energy can power the world. And essentially, that's a question about whether our individual needs for energy can be reconciled with our collective need to protect the planet against climate change. Context for what Malcolm and I are going to be talking about. We thought we'd start with the answers and then proceed from there. They're not answers. We're a few months into the programme, so you have to wait 2 or 3 years for final answers. But some early headline findings. Solar and wind are rapidly becoming cheaper. We think that they're sufficiently far advanced for us to say they will be key components of future energy systems around the world. And relatively modest shares of them can be integrated into existing energy systems without any problems. People shouldn't sort of think that we've got huge problems already, but extensive use of these technologies, because they're intermittent renewables, will depend on integrating them into electricity systems. We know the ways that might be done in principle, some mixture of flexible generation, flexible demand, interconnection and storage. And all this implies technical change in electricity systems, it implies market change, and we think already we know that that implies governance change as well. So that explains, I think, quite neatly why we see this as not an electrical engineering problem, though Malcolm is an electrical engineer, and will bring a lot of that to the programme, but why we see it as an interdisciplinary problem. It's a multidimensional problem. We need a multidisciplinary and indeed an interdisciplinary team to deal with it. We've got one. So Malcolm and I are the 2 co-directors of the programme. Becky Ford, who is somewhere here, there. At the front is our programme manager. We've got at least 2 of our lead researchers, Sarah Darby and John Rees here, and the other 4, I think, are not here because they're off travelling the world, spreading the message. Angus Johnson, Pete Grindrod, Peter Bruce and Cameron Hepburn. We've also got an increasingly great list. Becky put fabulous on this slide. That's her word, not mine. I don't use words like fabulous, if those of you who know me will recognise. But a really great group, an increasing group of affiliates, postdocs and students, as we aim to mainstream this into Oxford University's energy research programme. We're also very keen that our work should be properly grounded in the real world. This is a slide that we put in our project proposal to the Martin School, at which stage we had 4 core partners named there and a bunch of other supportive partners. Since then, we've got a group, even more partners. We can certainly add names like Good Energy, Aurora Energy, Western Power Distribution to that list, people who we're actively working with at the moment. So we're aiming to be both ambitious in looking into the far future for energy systems, but grounding that in the current reality. Let's start at the beginning. The link between energy and climate change, most of you will know very well, but this is taken from the report of the last IPCC. So over the last 40 years, from 1970 to 2010, carbon emissions went up. Greenhouse gas emissions went up. Most of them are carbon. The red and the yellow there are carbon. And the yellow, the biggest slice by far, and the most rapidly increasing slice, has been emissions from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels sit at the heart of the mitigation problem for climate change. This is a slide courtesy of Richard Miller, who is at the back there. Those of you who were here 2 weeks ago to hear Miles Allen's talk may recognise the sort of the messy straw diagram nature of it. This is a variant of a slide that Miles actually showed. So it's taking the outputs of integrated assessment models and looking at what they mean for carbon emissions as a function, as a proportion of business as usual emissions out to 2100. And the colour coding is related to the final, the peak concentration of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. Lots of different scenarios. Focus on the light blue ones. Those are the ones that are basically consistent with a 2-degree centigrade world, not 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. There's actually very little work on 1.5 degrees at the moment. And the message is rather straightforward. We need to get on with it. If we're to deliver that 2 degrees target, we need to reduce emissions from 2010, right, which by 3% a year, probably a bit quicker than that now because we haven't been doing that since 2010. But I think the interesting additional information is on the next slide, because this isn't the case for every sector. We need to think about what it means for different parts of the energy system separately. And if you take those same global integrated assessment models, they've got weaknesses. I don't want to defend them in great detail, but the message is pretty clear. If you split it by sector, industry, electricity, buildings and transport, electricity needs to go first. So the rate of decarbonisation of the electricity system that we need to look at is at least 6% a year. And that's pretty much what you get from, as you turn the existing infrastructure over, you replace it by zero carbon. You probably don't even quite reach 6% by doing that. But it means we need to move to low carbon electricity systems very quickly. So that's the climate context. What we're going to talk about next is the good news, because in a sense that's the challenge. What we're now going to talk about is the opportunity. Malcolm.
Right, so we know we need to change quickly and we need to change the energy system. So the first thing to do is worthwhile thinking, well, is this at all possible? And so one of the things we want to look at is to say, what are the resources that we have and what's available? So what we can see here is along the, this line here is basically what the global electricity demand is in 2008. And what we can see is that wind has enough potential to actually supply our total electricity demand. This one is our total primary energy demand that we require, and we can see that solar has more than 10 times the potential to actually supply that. So in principle, there are enough basic resources that we need in order to power our ongoing world. So let's see what this has in particularly context in the UK. So in about 2010, 2011, the UK government was thinking about putting in feed-in tariffs. And that is basically to say that we'll pay you for the energy that you put into the system if it comes from solar. And good old EEA technology made some predictions as to what was going to happen over the next 40 or so years. They gave a low scenario in the blue, a red scenario, which is in the central. The red scenario is like the midway scenario. And then they had the really, really ambitious scenario, which is the green scenario. And what's interesting to see is that what happened was that in 2016, we're actually sitting over there. We're about 10 times more solar deployed now than was ever expected to happen. And the question is, why did that happen? And the reason is because the economics turned out to be corrected to enable people to actually make this economically viable. And one of the reasons behind that was the cost of PV changed. But what we find is that this was not just a UK story, it's actually a global story as well. We can see here, this is the total number of solar generation capacity absolutely rapidly increasing in all areas. We can see that an early growth, and it's like 2010 to 2014, was Europe was leading the charge, and we now find that Asia is coming up fast in terms of leading the charge in developing solar. An interesting milestone is that about 2 weeks ago, Europe deployed a total of 100 gigawatts of solar, which is pretty impressive. One of the reasons why this has been so large is that price of solar, and this graph is often called, which is Swanson's law, which basically says is that as you increase the amount of capacity that you provide in the system, so you find that the price comes down. And what's been slightly interesting is that if you look from 1976, when you're looking about $100 a watt, down to 2015, where you're looking about 50 cents a watt, and you fit a line, you then get the nice blue line, and that basically says that your price halves for every 6.8 times increase in the production. But one of the interesting things that I've been looking at is to say, actually, if you look from about 2008, you can see the slope of the curve is very different from the average. And that's mainly because a lot of the large fabrication plants came online, and that really drove the price of solar down. And now we see that instead of every almost 7 times production, it's now every 2.5 times the amount of production, we're halving the price. Just to give you an idea, if you looked at it on a time basis rather than a production basis, okay, talk to the person next to you and say, how long do you think it takes for solar to halve in price, in time length, in time-wise? So just talk to the person next to you. You've got 20 seconds, go. Right, so if you look at the blue curve, so if you look to the traditional framing, you would come at something like 18 months. Every 18 months, solar would halve in price. If you follow what's happened since 2008, it's every 13 months. So that means every 13 months, your solar price is halving, okay? You've got to be careful, though. You're extrapolating on a logarithmic graph. That's always dangerous to do, but it just gives you an indication that this is a rapidly moving field. If you now take that, and this is now the production in terms of total amount of production by a particular technology versus the timescale, what we can see here is that this dotted line here is basically the amount of primary energy that's actually required. And you see coal, oil, and gas kind of like those blue, the black, the gray, and the orangey color basically dominating the world. But you can see what's happening to solar, which is the green one. We can see that is now starting to rapidly compete with that. And again, very dangerous to do, don't ever do this, is extrapolate on a logarithmic graph, because it gives you 2027, solar will give you the same amount of energy that we require for primary, but it's kind of like by 2035, it gives you 150%. So one's got to be careful with the extrapolations. But it kind of just, what the take-home message is to say that it's, before 2050, we are definitely going to be, there's going to be a substantial amount of solar. We're not having to wait to 2100. So, all looking good. Prices are coming down. There's more than enough energy around. Surely this is a done deal. Well, unfortunately, there are a few challenges along the way. This one shows you what happens in Germany at the moment. We can see that the green curve is wind, and the orangey curve is PV, and they kind of stack on top of each other. And we can see this is a typical August day in Germany, and the total peak capacity of the market is about 60 gigawatts. And we can see that between the two of them, they vary from a minimum amount on here of about 2% generation to around about 70% generation. So that means that there's a huge variability in the amount of energy that can be produced by solar and wind, and this causes problems. So a very simple model where we extrapolate what happens in 2015 to something that might look in 2050 looks and say, okay, what's going to happen if we just extrapolate things there? Now, the black line is the load, and we're saying that the orange and the blue curves are again solar and wind, and we've got a bit of biomass in there just to keep things sane. We can start to see that there's more than enough energy there, and in fact, it's designed so that the energy balance is exactly zero. So the amount of generation we need exactly manages the amount of load that we need over a year. However, what we find is that there are these periods where there's a substantial amount of peaks, okay? And also, more worryingly, there's a huge amount of troughs. And the question is, what do we do about that? The nice thing is that in summer, it's mainly solar dominated, so it's a diurnal load. So we need to be able to help with to work with that, and storage can manage things on a daily basis. So that's not too challenging. The challenge comes in when you look at the winter load. You can see there are these huge gaps because wind stops. We're mainly driven by the weather systems coming across, and you can have these large gaps. So the question is, how do we fill up those gaps? And they might be, and there's different ways of being able to do that. And then this analysis does not take account of heat, because we're going to have to decarbonize heat along the way, and that might well be electrical, need to be done with electrical, and we'll look at that a little more detail later on in the talk. Okay, so we know that solar and wind can provide the required needs, but providing at the right time and the right place presents us with a number of technical, economic, and social and political challenges to actually be able to do that balancing for us. So let's look at each of those three technical, economic, and social political challenges. What might they be, and what are the questions that they might raise? So first of all, technical challenges. That's probably the most straightforward, and that's why I'm involved in this one. Okay, because what we see is that we've got variable renewables, and so we need to be able to balance them. Remember, we said there were periods where there wasn't enough generation. They're going to meet the periods where the generation has to equal the load. Unfortunately, in an electrical system, we can't have electrons and tell them to wait around, please, while I need you to hang around until I need you. You can't do that. They have to be used at the same time that they actually energize them. And this happens at all the timescales, from the microseconds level, which is like the real-time stability, through to the daily levels, through to weekly and seasonal balancing. We have to be doing that balancing at all those timescales simultaneously. The way we can do that is we can either use flexible generation, and there's quite a lot of flexible generations just recently come on board in the UK. We can start looking at how we can change demand profiles. We can interconnect with other places, because when the sun's shining here, it may not be shining somewhere else, so that you can get diversity from the geographical location. And then, of course, we can start to look at energy storage and to see how that might be coming through. So all of those are fairly, they're moving, but the fastest moving area is energy storage, and it'll be interesting to see what's going on there. Okay, and the big question that we have for us is say, what are the future technologies that are coming along, and what is the right mix of technologies that we're looking at? So future technologies, it could include things like redox batteries and the like. If we look at batteries, we can see that over time, the costs are falling, okay? And what's been really interesting to see is that this is a paper that was done in 2015. Some of the data that I've got from in 2016 actually puts battery costs right down here. It's sub $200 a kilowatt hour. And once we start to get to that sort of level, we're now starting to get to places where actually not only electric vehicles now an extremely viable concept, and that's why Tesla is now produced its offering, which is being well oversubscribed, but also makes things for the diurnal balancing a lot more feasible. So those are the technical challenges. We now need to consider the economic challenges.
Thanks, Malcolm. Malcolm. So the question is, why, if we've got all this great technology, won't it just happen anyway? Won't markets deliver it naturally? No, is the short answer to that. And the reason is there's a number of market failures. The first is that in most of the world, we are not reflecting the climate change externality. We're not pricing carbon, so the renewable technology are not competing against fossil fuels on a fair basis. The second is that markets don't capture very well or don't allow innovators to capture the whole of the benefits of innovation. So there's a case for public support for innovation. The third, probably less well known, but we think pretty important in this area, if we're moving towards distributed technologies, technologies owned at the house and the business level, then information is not perfect. People don't behave in the way that rational economic models would predict that they behave. We may need product regulation, we may need better citizen engagement to deal with that, and we'll say a bit more about that. But often missed in this area is that electricity markets aren't like markets for other things, largely because of the point Malcolm made that electricity doesn't hang around it can't hang around waiting to be used. There are aspects of natural monopoly, both in the system operation and in the networks. And that leads to two particular issues which I want to address now. And this is probably it's the bit of the talk that I found hardest to write, so it may be the hardest to hear as well. So the capacity problem. We need to meet peak capacity. If there's one thing that energy policymakers are averse to, it's the lights going out. We understand why that is very well. But it means there always needs to be sufficient capacity to meet peak demand. How do we do that in electricity markets? Well, in a conventional wholesale market, the price is set by the operating cost of the last generator who comes onto the system, the short-run marginal cost in economic terms. So traditionally, that's been set by the price of coal or the price of gas. Whether that's the right way to do it, we could have an interesting debate about, but we're not going to that's not the point tonight. The point is that as we move towards renewables, which have an operating cost of approximately zero, we would expect these sorts of markets to have electricity prices set at zero for much of the year. And indeed, that is happening. Electricity prices have gone negative for significant periods in Germany. They've gone negative in the UK and in other places. And the more renewables we get, the more often this will happen. And if prospective power generators think they're going to get zero for their product, they're not likely to invest. I don't think you need to be a financial wizard to work that one out. How policymakers know this? So how are they addressing it? At the moment, it's really being addressed through capacity markets. They exist in the UK and some other European countries, in much of North America. The capacity market simply pays somebody for having capacity available there to generate. So there are ways to address the capacity problem. But these ways have traditionally been brought in to enable generation to get built. But we've said that generation may not be the right option. Demand response or storage or interconnection, these may be the right options. How do capacity markets help those actors? This is a question that's being asked increasingly. And how can capacity markets be designed fairly so that they can be used by either a very small player with demand-side response, a house with storage, or a very large generator? So you're going to see on all the slides we've got coming up some answers, but probably more questions. So the capacity problem is a known problem. Another known problem, but one that's less well addressed, is the flexibility problem. So the diagram there is the one that Malcolm's shown of this very high level of variation in the output of systems with high levels of intermittent renewables. Those variations need to be matched in some way. That can be by other generators changing their output. It can be by storage or interconnection or demand-side response. But our current electricity markets don't provide a general incentive for flexibility. You don't get paid more for being a flexible generator than an inflexible generator. So we currently rely on the system operator. In this country, that's National Grid, but it's always a monopoly function. The operator who has to keep the system in balance, and they generally do that by creating a whole series of other markets, often called ancillary service markets or balancing markets or both, which give people sort of ad hoc payments for flexibility in different forms. It's horrendously complicated. The number of people who understand balancing markets and flexibility markets is very small, but they're growing in value, and on some of our projections might outstrip the value in what we think of as normal energy markets in some of these future systems. So we have to think very hard about flexibility. Our first question seems an odd one. What is it? How do we define it? There are lots of literature on flexibility, but nobody has an agreed definition of it. Are the current markets fit for purpose? Can we go on using them? Or do we actually need to take a step back and really rethink whether electricity markets as we currently know them are fit for purpose? So that's some of the work that John and Cameron and others will be doing. All this leads to social and political challenges. Markets don't exist in isolation. They're a function of the social and political system that we're in. So there are governance issues. When we think of the electricity market, in this country we normally think of the Great Britain electricity market. That's what we mean. Of course, most of these markets are national, or in some cases in large countries at state level. They've essentially been designed to work with the actors who've been the dominant players. So large fossil fuel generators and inactive consumers. So consumers who just sit there and get electricity through a wire. We're talking about a world which could be very different from that, with literally millions of generators, with people who are traditionally thought of as consumers doing production, doing storage, varying their demand according to price. So there's a whole bunch of questions that come up about whether we're running the electricity system in the right way. How should local resources be included? If you're a small generator, you can't bid into the wholesale market because it doesn't work at that scale. How should transnational trading work in these markets? How do the costs I talked about of flexibility, who bears those costs? How are they shared out between the different participants in the market? How can that be done in a way that suits both large actors and small actors? What does treating them equally mean in that? Are markets always the appropriate solution? If you talk to anybody in Britain before about 1989, the idea of an electricity market was a bit odd. Yeah? We thought it was a natural monopoly that didn't operate through a market. Are we moving back into that world? More generally, what's the balance between markets and other forms of running the system? So some pretty fundamental questions there. But we also think some pretty important social questions around distributed resources. If we're going to have people owning their own generation resources, having distributed storage, responding on a timely basis to price signals, that implies a very different sort of engagement for all of us with the electricity system. We know that households don't invest like rational economic models say they ought to. Personally, I think that's probably a good thing, but it makes it harder to model. If you doubt that, just walk down the street and look where a street with photovoltaics and look where it's installed. Is it on the houses that are most south-facing with the biggest roofs? Not in general. It's on the houses of the people who are interested, the people who've got the capital to invest, the people who are interested in technology. So this is not the sort of world of somebody sitting down and doing a simple cost-benefit analysis. And demand-side response means people varying their energy use in accordance with some signal. Now, they may do that themselves in response to some peak pricing signal, or they may delegate that to their supplier or an aggregator to enable them to switch off a refrigerator or an air conditioning system under particular conditions. But that's very different from the traditional model of the way a customer works in an electricity system. So, are these systems socially acceptable? Well, yes, they will be for some people, but how many? How many people are going to do demand response? Do we know that? What sort of business models might be needed in order to get more people to do that? How do we design markets to get those sorts of business models? And regulators and government are now beginning to address these questions, but they are difficult. And I guess the bottom line for us is how much social engagement with distributed energy resources will there be under positive conditions, and what are those positive conditions? Because we can envisage a world where there's not much more distributed resources than there are now, or we can envisage a world where it's completely normal. They're very different futures. And so the rather complicated diagram that Malcolm showed you of what the technical responses are to the balancing problems, we make even more complex by saying it's not just a technical question, it's a social science question as well, and there's all these ways, incentives for capacity, for flexibility, for innovation that could be adopted, and a bunch of new forms of governance, thinking about how to get new actors involved and how to coordinate across borders. So that's the sort of working template we've got for our programme, and I think you can see now why it's quite a complex question we've got to answer. So we're not going to try and answer every question, but we are going to give you highlights in a couple of areas in our so-called deep dives. Malcolm.
Thanks, Nick. So what you want to do is basically, you've got through the boring bit, okay, so well done you. What you want to do now is actually take some of that theory and actually start to apply it and see, okay, what are some of the implications and what might be the way coming through. Now, this next piece is something which is, it's meant just as a framework for us to help us to think what might be possible. We're not saying this is what's going to happen. Okay, so just bear that caveat as you go along. So what we do is, if you talk about an emerging electrical system, my wife gets very frustrated with me because when I think of electrical systems, I go, ooh, power lines, okay? And a lot of people probably are not as challenged as I am in that area. But when we think about a power system, we basically think about power lines like that. But actually what I want to flip it around is to say, okay, let's think about it. What are some of the structures and the way the consumers interact with it that go beyond just the power lines? And then I'll come back to them. Okay, so if you have a look at what happened historically, is that if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, so like 1900, virtually every borough in this country had its own little energy generator, energy operator, and the like. And there were about 600, around about 600 little energy operators. In 1947, just post-war, they were all nationalized, and they created the thing called the British Electricity Authority. And this is actually a plaque that still remains today, and that's one of the few images I could find actually representing that. And the thing about the British Electricity Authority, it was a truly vertically integrated authority in that it did everything from generation through to transmission over reasonably long distances, although probably not in 1947, they weren't very long distances, through to distribution, and actually it would sell the energy to the customers. So they did everything from burning the coal to collecting the bill. Okay, and that's a truly vertically integrated system. There are a few of those left in other places. Back in South Africa, Eskom is one of those. But if you start to think about what does the structure actually look like of a system, you can see a vertically integrated company basically has two key characteristics. First of all, they're centrally provided. There's a central provision, both in terms of large power stations in one central place, but also in terms of one large monolith that's actually providing the service. In terms of the customer view, as a customer, you're extremely dependent on that one provider. But what you buy for that, though, what you get for that, is very low variability in terms of price and provision of service. You get a very good provision of service at a very low price, which is rock stable. However, because of dependence, people thought, well, we can't have a monopoly. Let's try and make customers more independent. So we then created the liberalized market in the 1990s. And what that does, it allows us to move from a vertical company to a company where we're increasing independence of the customer, but we get a high variability because we now got all these different tariffs that we can play with. So a liberalized market would sit somewhere like that. Then we come into the 2000s, and what we find is that, as I just mentioned, that we need to start looking at alternative ways of producing energy. So we produce the feed-in tariff, which enables ordinary people to have solar on their system. So what we're now starting to do is we're going from a centralized generator to a decentralized generating system. Okay, so where we had central provision originally, we're now moving to a system where we've got decentralized provision. And we can see that people sitting there are sitting with feed-in tariffs sit more or less over in that place there. The reason why I haven't put it more vertically is because with a feed-in tariff, there's a very fixed way that you can only deal with it. You only get a certain amount. There's no, you can't change the rate that you get for your feed-in tariff. It's very fixed. So you've got some independence, but you've got a very low variability in terms of the financial transactions you can have with that. So the question is, okay, we're kind of missing something to say what's going to be sitting in the top right-hand corner here to say, okay, what happens if you've got very decentralized and highly independent? And in that case, you get to, get my slides right. Moving that direction, what we're starting to see is a lot more community schemes coming up, where people are starting to own their own assets and large-scale assets. So we're starting to see community schemes starting to provide a transition to a place where we can start to transition from large-scale individual power plants to a completely independent and distributed system. So community system sits somewhere there. In the top right-hand corner is where we go completely off-grid. And this is where individuals are actually have the sufficient finances to say, okay, I no longer want an energy system. I don't want to have to be connected up to my alliance company, and I'll provide all the energy system myself. The interesting question is that if you look at a number of countries like Spain and New Zealand, actually it's financially worth people's while to actually go off-grid. It's cheaper for them to buy the battery systems, to buy the solar PV systems and do everything. They actually get a better service and they don't have to pay their particular supplier. So the extreme version is if you go up to the top left-hand corner where we're going completely off-grid. The problem that you have is when you go off-grid completely, you're now left where you're exposed to high variability. You've only got your own load to deal with, okay, and you've only got your own generation to deal with. So your resilience is pretty low. So that's quite a challenging place to be. So the question is to say, where can we do something where we can trade off some of that complete independence, but get some resilience into the system? And so what we're starting to see is an emerging market players, which are peer-to-peer energy schemes and energy systems people. And a typical example in this country is McCulloch. One of the early starters is Van den Bron in the Netherlands. Aragami Energy has just started up in Cambridge as well. But the basic idea is that you now have people who produce energy and they trade directly with the end consumer. Okay, so you have from the peer generator selling directly to the peer consumer. But what's interesting in this model is that you can actually get it where the household is both a producer and a consumer, so they can start to trade this. So I think of this as think of the Uber of the energy space or the Airbnb of the space. Okay, and this is something that is starting to grow. So where does that fit in my little scheme? Well, we can see that there's quite a lot of independence, but we're also starting to get a bit of scale, so we can start to see that it's going to be sitting just off to the left here. Now, one of the challenges we can see is that there are two characteristics that we as consumers love. We want to be independent, but we also want low variability. So the question is, at the moment, our system is fragmenting where we can have one or the other, okay, and we can't do both. So the question is, can we think of a system where we can get the benefits of the small scale together with the benefits of the big scale? And so the question is, can we think of a system which works at different scales? It's useful to think of other systems where you have similar characteristics which are independent of scales, and one of the classic ways of thinking that is looking at fractals. And in a fractal, we basically start off with a very simple system where we provide a very simple rule, and basically here we can say that we start off with a square, and we just build on two squares there so that we form an isosceles triangle. And we basically say, right, now at the second level, we again got a square, and we're going to stick on two squares on that and form a little triangle. And so we go forward and forward. And the advantage of looking at this is that we can see that the scale is going from the large to the small, but but the same rules apply at every scale. And so you build it up, and you build it up, and you eventually get to something that looks like that. And this is called the Pythagoras tree. And this is a very simple example of what a fractal looks like. Now, amazingly, if you look at our electrical grid as a single line diagram, which engineers do, and I'm sure most of you don't, you can actually see it's actually got very much like a fractal-like structure. We've got at the lower scale here, we've got something where we've got the feeder that's feeding lots of different homes. Then we've got a little substation. That then is multiple substations get connected together, so this is the next scale. Lots of those get connected together from the 11 kV to the 33 kV network, and so eventually you build up to the larger scale at the top. So we can see, actually, our system, our distribution network, has already got a fractalized system that's associated with it. The question is, that's the only part of the system that's got a fractal thing. Can we actually think of extending that a bit further? Where we can say we go from the very small scale, which is the local level, right up to the national scale, where it's got certain characteristics which we keep constant, and we allow that scale to be able to be to use beneficially for us. So let's start off with the very small scale. Okay, so the small scale I'm going to consider in a house. Now, what we've got to do is look at what are the characteristics which you're going to keep constant as we're going through. And so when you're thinking about homes, we're not thinking about lengths or anything like that. We're actually thinking about various services. So we're starting to think in this field, and we're saying is that if you start to look at it, we're going to have some services which must run at a specific time period. So when your favorite TV program comes on, you want to be sitting there watching it. You're not going to be turning off your TV program because your energy is getting too expensive. That's not going to happen. So you're going to have some loads which are must run. You might have some loads like your hot water tanks, assuming we go into the electrical system in the future, where actually when it happens, it doesn't matter as long as it happens over the day. So it now becomes discretionary loads. Okay? That allows us to then do demand response without affecting the consumer's service that we provide. We then might have some type of generation, okay, so sitting in there, so we might have some local generation sitting in there, and we might have some storage. This is the good old Tesla Powerwall, and so this is now allows us to think of a system. So these are the key components. There's one that's missing though, and the question is how do these start to play with each other? And how do we make sure that they respond to each other? And so what we need is a manager that sits there and there as well, that manages this energy system. I've drawn it as a human, but that could be, it's actually a blend of a human and artificial controller that will actually be managing the system, but under your control. Okay? And the objective of this manager is basically to provide the service for you as well as you can, but to do it in the most cost-effective way, both to yourself and to the system. So the question is, okay, that's at the lowest level. What about the next level up? So the next level up is we've got your local road. And if you think about it in terms of our little diagram, you can say, okay, so here's our house, and we've now got our local road, which is the feeders, and they join each other. At this level, we're going to have exactly the same things. We're going to have must-run loads. Now, obviously, all the demands that are coming from the homes that are not met by the local homes, things become a must-run load at the next level up. But we also might include things like street lighting and other things that come into at that level. We're also going to have some additional discretionary loads, so we might think of something like a central heating system where you might have some heating stores that are coming in there. You might even have local generation, so some of you might know things like the OSD lock hydro scheme, where that's at a very local level, some extra generation coming in. You might have some storage coming through, and again, you're going to have a manager which is going to manage that next level up. However, at this point, there's one key difference. You don't have a single actor, you have multiple actors coming together. So that manager has to somehow create a market, and so you have to have a market at that particular level. And that market mechanism now enables you to make the trade-offs between the different load and storage options that you have available to you. Obviously, even at the road level, although life gets a lot better because things are less variable, you need to be able to, there'll be some either excess load or excess generation, which you can then pass up to the next level up, which might be something like at the city scale. So now you can start to see that we're increasing more of the medium voltage network, but once again, we've got exactly the same characteristics at the city level. And believe it or not, we can then take it up to the next level up. I said my transmission lines were coming back again. And to say what we can now do is that whatever can't be met at the city now has to be met nationally. Again, because we're getting towards the end of the fractal, we've got to be a little bit careful what we do. And that again, you're going to have must-run loads, but now the generation must be the generation of last resort, because what you've got to say at the top level it has to guarantee that you're producing enough energy throughout the whole system. So there's a slight change at that top level. And it can do that through either generation or through storage. So again, that manager there can now start to manage the market. So the question is, let's just think a little bit about to say, okay, let's go back to the household level. Can we actually detect these multiple levels? Because if we can then enable that little manager of ours to be a lot more sensible because he's not only managing the local system, but he's actually helping to manage some of the levels up. So let's consider a place where we actually do measurements at the home. And indeed, what we can do, and this is some of the work that one of my postgraduates is doing, is Renkan, is to say, we can actually look at something like the frequency and the rate of change of frequency, and we can detect what's happening at the national level. So that's working in here, we can find out what's happening at this scale. What we can also do by looking to seeing what's happening at these transformers, which are continually changing their taps to maintain the voltage at the level, we can start to see what's happening at the city level, and we can start to see what's actually happening at the local level. So once you start to develop this type of technology, it now means your manager is actually a lot more smarter because they can start to understand what's happening at multiple levels. So it means that it can actually start to make decisions which are not only good for you, but good for the system. And by the way, if you're making changes that are good for the system, you can charge them for it. So you can start to get value into the system. What this also means is that you've now got the potential for much increased resilience. So how does this play into my structure? Well, we start off by saying we worked at the household level, we went to the row, the community, the city, the regional, the national, and you can even think about it as going to the transnational, and if you want to really go to, global if you wanted to. And so what you can see that this type of fractal grid allows us to cover the space where we get both the control and the independence at the high level, but we also get the opportunity to get the benefits from having that low variability from the national level. So that just gives you a quick insight to one potential way that the market might move forward. We're now going to move on to Nick looking at how do we deal with heating in the renewable world.
Thanks, Malcolm. You remember at the start I said electricity needs to go first to decarbonise the global energy system, but electricity is not everything. So I'm going to talk about heating, start with 3 reasons why heating matters. The first is it's big. That's OECD energy use by end use. Heat is bigger in final energy terms than electricity and a little bit bigger than transport. And of course, heat is used in a number of different places, but most of it in buildings, either residential or commercial buildings. And the bad news is that whilst we need to decarbonise heat, the trend is probably in the opposite direction, at least globally. And that's because traditionally heat in developing countries has been highly reliant on traditional biomass. We can't expect and shouldn't expect that to continue for development reasons. So China, India, Africa, Latin America, those biomass numbers are going to go down and they're probably going to be replaced by modern energy sources. The third problem that heating's got is that it's strongly seasonally peaked. That's a pretty obvious statement, but it's one that energy policymakers sometimes forget. So this is taking the UK as an example. That's the calculations that National Grid used to predict gas demand in average weather conditions and in cold weather conditions. And so the peak load for heating in the UK is 160 gigawatts. Now, do you know what peak electricity demand is? It's about 60. It's about 60. So total peak heating demand is about 2.5 times total peak electricity demand. So if you've got any thoughts about, well, let's just move our heating over to electricity, replace our gas boilers with resistant heaters, well, maybe, but not overnight for sure. It's a much bigger problem than many people have bought into. That doesn't mean it's insoluble with electricity, because with heat pumps, which you can use, operate at much more than 100% efficiency. But it is an issue that needs to be addressed. So what are the low carbon heating options we've got? I've listed 6 here, but the top 3 I think are pretty minimal in many conditions. Waste heat, In the sorts of worlds we're talking about, there may not be much waste heat from power stations because we may not have very many power stations. Geothermal is great if you're in Iceland, but not so great in Oxford. Solar is great in summer, not really when we need most of our heating. So we are pretty much looking at systems based on biofuels efficiency and low carbon electricity. Biofuels, again, in large metropolitan urban areas, wastes can give you a bit, but I don't think we should be looking to replace most of our heating with biofuels, given the pressure there is on food systems. Efficiency can certainly do quite a lot. Those of you who know me and my background would expect me to say that. It will, in my view, provide a major contribution to low carbon heating simply by lowering the amount of heat that we need. How much? 50%, 70% if you're really optimistic in the long term, but certainly not 100% of it. And so that's actually why most policymakers and most energy models think that heating is going to be supplied by low carbon electricity in a low carbon world, because there aren't many other options left. There's a larger resource if renewables are widely deployed, but the costs are high, so we will need to use low carbon electricity very efficiently for heating. That's entirely what's projected. This is a plot taken from the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change heat strategy, showing how they expect, or at least model, heat demand being met out to 2050. The big slices in 2050, air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, entirely driven by electricity. So we're modelling a world where electricity provides our heating. What are the issues for that? Well, in a cool, temperate country like the UK, we'd probably have a high dependence on heat pumps. How much electricity would we need to power those heat pumps? We've done the sums, about 75 terawatt hours a year for space heating every house. That would add about 25% to electricity demand. That sounds plausible. But it's strongly peaked in winter, so it would add about 70% to electricity demand. We'd need 70% more power stations in order to deliver all our residential heat. How much would that cost? I could give you the number in billions, but I thought it would be better to say about £1,500 to £3,000 per household. That's not for the heating system, that's for the power station that supplies your heating system. Your heating system would probably cost at least that much again. I think we need to be very careful about assuming, given concerns about affordability, that that will happen. So our conclusions are certainly that moderating the demand on electrification of heating by using biomass and efficiency more is an important thing to do. But actually we do need to think about whether we can smooth out heating demand to reduce that peak. Smoothing probably means storage. You aren't going to do demand response seasonally. You are not going to say, yeah, I'll be cold in winter and have my heating system on in summer. That's not going to happen. What about storage for heat, interseasonal storage? Well, Malcolm showed this plot earlier. We think that storage may come down to $100 per kilowatt hour. That's economic if you're storing energy every day and using it every day. You're using your system 365 times a year. If you use it once a year, the economics are precisely 365 times worse. We think you probably need interseasonal storage to cost something like $1 per kilowatt hour to be effective for interseasonal storage. You can probably get a pile of coal at that sort of price, but you will never get a battery at that price. So some serious innovation called for. Are there any plausible options that are low carbon? Yeah, we think there are. There's piles of wood, of course. That's a very ancient technology for storing thermal energy. Thermal storage itself, big hot water tanks, not a sexy technology, but might just work. Phase change materials, which can essentially store the latent heat of fusion, may be a better option, but neither of them easy technologies. But the more surprising technology that's beginning to get attention is low carbon gases, turning electricity into gas. But both of these require a bit more development. Let me say a bit about the so-called power to gas technology. The concept's pretty straightforward. You use electricity from solar or wind, electrolyzer, you electrolyze H2O, you get H2, and you get H2 and O2. It's not the chemistry's easy. You can use the hydrogen directly, or you can store it. You can ultimately use it for power generation, or you can methanate it, turn it into methane, and then you can use either hydrogen or methane in principle in the gas infrastructure, and that gives you, importantly in this context, access to existing gas storage, which is cheap, basically. So that's the advantage of doing it, and there's a question about, so the concept is straightforward. When you've got lots of power and low demand, you turn your electricity into gas, you store the gas, and then when the supply and demand conditions are the other way around, you turn the gas back into power, or you use it for heat, and there's some advantages in using it for heat. They don't look very exciting, actually, power to gas plants. That's one in Germany, but then electrolyzers don't look very exciting. The advantages, the key advantages are it can avoid you with constraining off renewables. You remember those spikes of solar in summer greater than demand? You can deal with that just by switching the solar plant off, but it is a bit of a waste not to use something. This technology allows you to use that energy productively. It potentially, therefore, allows you to use solar energy from the summer in the winter. So it's addressing that interseasonal problem. And you can use, because you can use the existing gas infrastructure to do it, it may be a relatively cheap thing to do at that point. It's not a trivial problem. Should we be using hydrogen or methane, or some people even say ammonia? How do we get the cost of electricity and methanation down? What do we need to do to the existing gas infrastructure if it's to use hydrogen? Hydrogen's smaller molecules than methane, for those of you who want to think of why it might be a problem. And how do we convert that vast array of end-use heating equipment to hydrogen? Though the older members of the audience will remember that sort of transition has been done before. Indeed, when I were a lad, we actually did use hydrogen in gas systems, a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. That's what town gas was. But I think it is just fascinating to think that after 20, 30 years of thinking about how do we use gas for power generation, we're now thinking about how do we use power for gas generation. And that's sort of one of the strange things that's beginning to happen in this new world. So let's end with what it all means. Malcolm, are you going to say what it all means? I'm going to say what it all means, okay. Addressing climate change probably certainly is about stopping using fossil fuels, and that probably means using an awful lot more renewables, but it's not just that. Our argument is it's a systemic change. The technologies will change, but the scales of operation will change, the market structures will need to change, the types of social engagement will need to change, and therefore the policies and probably old governance systems will need to change. So energy's been a boring world for most of the 30 years that I've worked in it, but it's not going to be boring for the next 40 years. The meta challenge will be to get all these things to happen together whilst maintaining a reliable energy system. Thank you.
There's time for questions now, and at some point Caroline will turn my microphone on. So this is being filmed and live webcast, so can you make sure that when I give you the microphone for the question, that you hold it like this and it will work with it. I'm just telling us to turn it on.
Good old technology.
Hello.
Yay. Right, do we have any questions? Mark?
Thanks. The biggest problem I can see is the economic one, in that you're paying for assets that you're not using a lot of the time. I mean, your hydrolyzer is a good example. If you're only using that during peaks of solar, it's sitting there idle for 95% of the time, and you've got capital costs on that. And the same, because so you've got replicated systems, haven't you? You've got renewables, you've got backup, you've got storage, you've got all sorts of stuff, which is replacing what we've currently got now, which is dispatchable fossil fuels. And presumably it's going to be more expensive. Can you see ways in which that's ever going to be properly economic, that as a sort of system?
I think we know quite a lot about the economics of renewables and their intermittency. So that's, I mean, and you know, we've shown those curves. I think we're now talking about solar in this country costing large-scale solar costing 10p a kilowatt hour, which is lower than I ever dreamt it would be, and most people ever thought it would be. And in a place that's got, like the Gulf, with 2.5 times as much sun, that's 4p a kilowatt hour. So it is now the case that the cheapest way to generate electricity in the Persian Gulf is with solar energy. And I think the day that I realised that was the day that I realised something quite fundamental had changed. The stuff about power to gas, yeah, that's much more up in the air. But the economics don't look completely infeasible. Electrolysis is basically, well, you've done the experiment at school, haven't you? It's basically sticking electrodes in water. It's not that expensive. That's not to say it's cheap or will happen, but I don't. People are now saying it looks like a feasible form of long-term storage. And as I've pointed out, what it allows you to do then is get better capacity factor out of your solar and wind systems. That's essentially what it's about. So it's a complex calculation, I agree with that, but it's not infeasible.
The other way of thinking about it is, especially if you're producing something like methane or ammonia, is the co-products you're producing are actually very valuable. So there are other benefits. So ammonia is extremely valuable, so commodity. Okay, another question?
Yes, hi, Robert Chris from Open University. For me, it's often said the devil's in the detail.
Yeah.
But in this area, for me, the devil's in the scale. Okay, we're currently emitting 10 petagrams, more or less, of carbon a year from fossil fuels. And another 1.5 or so from the agriculture, and another 3.5 or so in non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases. So when you project these technologies forward, do you anticipate at some point in the future, and you can specify the horizon as you see fit, that we're going to get rid of all of those, or are we going to have some sort of continuing rump? And if we are, what sort of scale do you think that continuing rump will be? Bearing in mind that we're not just talking about replacing the fossil fuel that being used now, but one assumes that energy demand will continue to grow for all sorts of reasons, which one needn't go into in detail now. So we're also talking about renewable energy to meet that increased capacity. So it's quite a lot of stuff.
I guess, go for it.
I mean, firstly, I don't think energy demand will grow in the developed world. It hasn't grown it's actually going down in this country. Not everybody knows that, but it's true. And electrification itself produces a big efficiency benefit. So an electric vehicle is more efficient than a petrol vehicle. Electric heat pump is. These are relatively big effects. So I think we should be looking to reduce our demand. I mean, in developing countries, that is not the case. Demand will continue to go up, and it ought to. The other point I'd make is I don't think anybody's got a blueprint, but it's an ordered problem. The slide I showed early on basically says, start with decarbonising electricity. I'd add, start by reducing demand through efficiency, and then you've probably got an ordered problem. I think we would say transport's probably next. We're seeing growth of electric vehicles. Buildings will be more difficult. Freight transport will probably be more difficult. Aviation will be even more difficult again, and some industrial processes. So do we know how to do those now? No. Do we need to know how to do them now? It would be nice, but I mean, actually, we do know enough to get on and start by doing a lot. So I think that's I'd see it as a sort of ordered problem, and let's get on and do the stuff we know we can do now.
Yep.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks for all that. I'm wondering how far, thus far, you've considered the role of electric cars in the future as being a very large, almost free, smart form of storage.
So I'll answer that one. So what's interesting is I looked at this question in about 2011, and at that stage, it was going to cost you in the order of 30 US cents per kilowatt hour just to replace the battery that you're degrading by using that. So that means that your value chain should be better than 30 cents a kilowatt hour to do it. Today, you're looking at about 2.5, 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So the answer is it's going to come on. Those of you who read the FT will have noticed that, I think it was yesterday, Nissan has now said they are going to start rolling all the Nissan Leafs are now going to be able to do power to grid as part of the standard thing. All the Teslas are going to be doing it. It's something that's going to come through. Yes, that's going to be a big kick. You've got to remember though, each vehicle has probably got about, what, say 30 kilowatt hours involved in it. So when you get a few million of them, that starts to get really interesting. That is one of the things we take into account in the future.
I think it's probably fair to add that's not a universal view. The man sitting in front of you, Phil Grunwald, who knows quite a bit about storage, would still say you should have separate the right battery for a car is not the right battery for a power system, and that's probably true. But the counter argument is yours. If you've got it in the vehicle system anyway, why not use it? And I think that's a debate that continues.
Nick King from the Low Carbon Hub. Can I suggest there's another market failure, which I don't think you've included, which is the cost of upgrading a 20th century grid, single direction, to a dynamic 21st century grid. The way the market's structured at the moment, that cost is all pushed onto the latest developer, the last one to want to connect to the grid. And as you know, in Oxford, that means nothing's being built more than 50 kilowatts. And it's a market failure across Oxfordshire. And I didn't see that mentioned in your list of failures.
Well, I think my answer is grids are a market failure. Grids are a natural monopoly, and it's not sensible to have a market in them where you have multiple grid providers. So that's why we regulate them. Yeah. So, but yeah, your point's right, and it's going to add to the cost of the grid to make them fit for purpose. Yeah, and it would be nice if SSE did it here. Yeah.
Hello, David Calver from People and Planet here in Oxford. I've got really two parts to the question. One is, can you see the transition to a low-carbon future really being achieved unless there's a significant challenge to corporate power, and in particular incumbent monopolies or near monopolies? And secondly, would you like to comment perhaps on any aspects of your work that might take into account the kind of social, cultural aspects of this transition and the role that diversity plays and things like women and the role of women in creating a, the shift to more community-based, local, compassionate energy systems?
I'll take the first one, you do the second one.
Thanks, Malcolm.
I'll do the first one. So the interesting thing is that if your regulatory regime could change a little bit, I think you'll see a flood of new players coming into the market. The regulatory regime needs to be able to separate out the, at the moment it stops things like DNOs benefiting from what customers do and that type of thing. As soon as you remove those kind of barriers, then I think you'll see a very rapid change in the market. What I keep on saying is that, if you look at smart meters, they're a failure in multiple levels. And one way that I always say that look at the failure is that they needed about 5 or 6 demonstration trials to show whether there's any value in them. Apple had one trial to see whether the iPad was any use at all. Okay, and look how many people have iPads now. I think that if you reduce the regulatory burden and allow for new forms of value to be created out of the system, new players will come into that system pretty rapidly and capture that value and will take the incumbents out. We're already seeing that in what Tesla did in the automobile space. I work in the mobility space, and virtually every other manufacturer I'm talking to at the moment have radically changed their plans in the last 6 months. Yeah. The second part?
I'd probably answer it by saying, asking Malcolm, if you go to a conference on power engineering, what's the gender split?
You might have a Becky and then about 1,000 other men in the room. Okay, so that's one of the problems.
And then we'll ask Chris Church at the back. Chris, if you go to a community energy meeting, what's the gender split?
I'd say it's actually I'd say it was getting better, probably closer to 75-25, but it still tends to be bearded, balding enthusiasts. And I think this is a real... Sorry. I did have a question. Thank you. I mean,
so that's answered that question, I said, yeah?
No, I think it's a real...
It's getting better,
I mean, social justice is a real part of this.
Yeah.
And I look forward, personally, I look forward in my retirement having my parish council having a part-time energy manager who will wake up in the morning, check the weather forecast, and arrange the import or export of electricity into my neighbourhood, depending as to how much we're generating. But my question was about American futurist Ray Kurzweil. Is recently suggested, you may know this, that we are on an exponential curve for solar, doubling every 2 and a bit years. And of course, as you say, never predict on these things.
Yeah.
But he suggests that this is such a disruptive and economically attractive technology that we are not at the moment really getting our heads around what's going to happen. And the comparison would be, as you just mentioned, iPads, would be the growth of smartphones. No one predicted that probably millions of people worldwide are busy making apps for a phone they didn't even know they'd have 10 years ago. And surely the challenge here is not so much to tackle the problems, but to really train up in innovation and disruption, because we're so good at spotting the problems, and we're not good at really building in the capacity to innovate.
I would say that we kind of spotted that. That's why we got the program. We recognized about 5-6 years ago that actually there's a big change happening, and that and this is kind of why I was trying to show the fractal grid is a completely different way of thinking of what a grid actually looks like. And that was just one small little innovation and the plethora of opportunities that are out there. And I think you're absolutely right. We are going to have to completely rethink what a grid looks like. And that there's going to be opportunities for value creation there. And as you said, what does that energy app look like in the future? I don't know.
I'd just add one note of caution. Well, I could add several, but I'll add one. Product markets, yeah, they might change with a 2-year cycle. Infrastructure systems, 10, 20, 30-year cycle, they're not aligned, and I think that's one of the problems.
Hi, got a question for Nick. Alex Clark from International Development. I know you mentioned carbon pricing at the beginning and that you haven't seen a lot of action. I was wondering, what do you think the role of carbon pricing might be in what you've described, vis-a-vis behavioural change, and which one is more useful, whether there's any research that's indicating the scale of potential demand gains and so on? Thank you.
I think the key role of carbon pricing is just changing the relative economics of fossil fuels and the alternative to fossil fuels, not so much in changing demand levels. I think the work we've done on demand indicates that it's more complex than that, and that relatively small price changes don't make much of a difference. But 1 or 2 pence a kilowatt hour on fossil fuel electricity can tip the balance in a lot of places. So whereas in the long term, we might look to a world where renewables are cheaper simply because they're very cheap. We've got to get through this phase where actually we need to make sure that the market reflects the social cost of carbon emissions. I mean, we won't necessarily do it, but because of the problems we all know, and that's why it's worth looking at other ways to bring solar in. So solar's coming in Germany and this country with feed-in tariffs, without a carbon price, really, without much of a carbon price. So I wouldn't say we have to have a carbon price or we're doomed, but it would certainly help.
Hello, Caroline Johnstone. I was just wondering to what extent the embodied carbon of these technologies is still an issue.
Okay, so in 1976, when solar panels were $100 a panel, your payback time in energy was never. Okay, you never got them. Even if you had to run the thing to death, and you still never got the energy back. If you look at solar panels today, the payback time in somewhere like Spain or Germany is probably about 3 months. Wind turbines is probably about 6 months. So, yeah.
I saw Paul Massara give a talk. He was the head of RWE Power, and he said that they'll never build another power station. RWE will never build another power station. So what's the appetite within the utility companies for this technology? I mean, they must be able to see some value in this, for that they can cream off something in a distributed network. Have you sort of investigated that?
Was that before or after Paul was thrown out of RWE?
Yeah, well, that was after. He was looking for a new job.
Which probably sums it up, that a lot of people, I think, know this change is quite likely to happen at least. But if you're in a company that is embedded in, that's an incumbent, embedded in the existing system, it can be hard to admit that. That's why it's an interesting time.
I mean, I think what's really interesting is that your classic electrical engineer is ultra conservative. You know, I've seen, you know, I used to work in a power station, and their modern technology was one that had been around for 10 years. Okay, that was the cutting edge technology we were putting into power stations, you know, 10 years later. And what Nick was saying earlier on is that we got this kind of embedded thing to say that, you know, if you put something into the system, it's going to last for 40 years. Now, my closest parallel that I can think of is that this is exactly the same thinking that my guys in telephone communication systems used to think 20 years ago. Now, when you put an exchange in, it had to last for 20 years. You know, how often do we change one of these now? Okay, so it's a rapid change. So I think what you'll find is that the existing energy companies are really worried about this. They don't see a future. It's a question of existence. You know, I made a prediction 2 years ago that at least 2 of the big 6 won't exist by next year. So let's see what happens. That was just a prediction, but let's see what happens. Yeah.
Hello, Matt Prescott. Obviously, the national grid's got a really central role, and they're the equivalent of the IT guys saying you can't bring your own phone, you've got to use like a BlackBerry. If we move into a world where you sort of bring your own power, you know, they have you bring your own phone, and that's just overridden all of the incumbents' wishes, and it's just sort of, if the solutions come along which are cheap enough, which we start adopting, will all this become irrelevant? You know, that the sort of the individual choices, like in a fractal way from the ground up, could override the system thinking that is currently driving.
Well, the interesting thing is that we run a program here called NEST, which is New Energy System Thinkers, where we're actually getting some of our PhD graded students to engage with various actors in the energy industry, and one of them is National Grid. And the problem they came to us to say is, what is the role of individual consumers and prosumers? How are they going to affect our business? So I would actually say they're ahead of the game. They're thinking about what are the issues going to be and how they're going to have to work with it. I think that, okay, so my kind of view is to say that I'm kind of like this, the fractal idea, where the National Grid still has a role to play, but it's a different role to what it has already. And so that there's still a life going on from it. And the reason why I like them is because they kind of provide a ceiling on things like what the prices are going to be like. So you don't get these wild excursion in prices. They kind of put a damper on the system. So those large-scale industries, I think, have a role to play, but it's going to be very different from what it is now.
I don't think anybody knows, though.
Yeah.
Right. That would be.
That's why I said it's going to be different. I didn't say what it was going to be. I've been careful. Yes.
Hi, Avon Satcher-Malloy. I'm wondering to what extent, or if you're looking at whether or not this transition towards decentralized grids, fractal grids, and peer-to-peer networks, if that's applicable or viable in the developing country context, where you have very vertically integrated incumbent utilities and energy sector reform hasn't really come to fruition in many places.
ESCOM man can answer that.
Yeah, okay, so I'll wear 2 hats. So what's interesting is that we're, for instance, doing a project right at the moment in Kenya where we're actually building up a fractal grid there. Okay, so we're actually doing this on the ground. The advantage is because you're going into communities which don't have any energy provision already, so you don't have an embedded incumbent, and it's actually easier to work with. What's interesting is that actually when you talk to the people like KEPCO and the like, the Kenya Energy Power people, or my old colleagues back in ESCOM in South Africa, they recognize that actually anything that can actually take strain off the system is good. So they're actually a lot more they're actually receptive to it. They just want to make sure that people don't get exploited along the way. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I had two questions. One was with regard to the adoption of DC grids on a local level as opposed to AC grids, especially since all electronics is mostly DC. And the second was, I know you were talking more about renewables, but what about nuclear power, especially fusion as well, which may become viable by 2050, possibly, and also fission.
Okay, so fusion won't get, I mean, you talk to the guys, fusion doesn't get viable about till 2150 on a large scale. So that's a long-term play. Okay, so that's that one there. DC, I think what's interesting is that DC is actually starting to play a much bigger role. We're looking in Kenya to go to a DC grid with an AC component, but what you're going to be using is not using sine waves, but square waves, because that gets rid of a whole lot of problems. So that's the DC one. So I think you'll start to see a lot of new homes are starting to have a DC wiring in them already. So that trend is just going to grow. Nuclear, you answer that one.
I think there's wider issues with nuclear that people can have their own views on. Many people who know what mine are. I'm not going to advertise those. I think there's two issues I'd point to. One is the timescale issue, right? That nuclear, whether we like it or not, at least the current generation of technology is in that infrastructure category of turnover. So I always annoy my former colleagues in the Atomic Energy Authority by pointing out that in the time it will take us to build one nuclear power station, we'll change the whole generation of lighting technology twice, right? Yeah. And that's the problem that nuclear is suffering from. The other slightly more technical issue is actually it's not very flexible. Yeah. So actually combining nuclear and renewables, whilst it might seem like, well, that's an easy low carbon solution, just have both, you know. It's actually technically not that easy to do. And I don't think anybody's really got their heads around that. Apart from that, think what you like about nuclear.
Yeah. So with your bottom-up sort of fractal model that you had your sort of last sort of resort supply side. How do you think, given that sort of probably comparable to a black start at the moment, that could be incentivized in the future?
Do you mean how does that type of model get incentivized?
No, particularly the sort of the stopgap at the very end, particularly with the energy and power profile that you'd need.
Well, okay, so it comes back to what people were saying earlier on, is that we've got all these assets there already. What are they going to be doing in the new world? Okay, this gives them a role to play. Okay, so what this does is that one would look at providing a mechanism that would incentivize them to maintain that ongoing role. How we do that, we haven't got there yet, but we know that there's a role to be had there.
I think that's where something like a capacity market would be useful. I mean, those existing assets, how do you stop people closing them down? Well, have an auction to, they'll then pay, and it would probably be a relatively small amount to stay on the system. I think that's doable.
Hey Nick, hey Malcolm. Seth Collins, Avon's classmate. Quick question, you've kind of touched on both of these, but in terms of embedded political interests and embedded generation, you just spoke a little bit about capacity markets, and what we're seeing right now in some of the more advanced renewable integrated grids is actually an uptake in very dirty fossil generation to meet specific demand bands. On top of that, Malcolm, you talked about how quickly you're seeing the strategy of car companies change when you've got a leader in that. With the more embedded infrastructure that's required for grids, how do you see that transition or strategy changing for your larger embedded energy companies in, say, natural gas or coal or oil?
Okay, coal's easy. They're closing them down. Okay, so that one's easy. I think it comes back to the problems that those large companies have had 40 years of learning. This is how you do things. And that's no longer, all the assumptions that are based behind the ways and their models of doing things is changing fundamentally. And I think a lot of them are struggling to catch up to recognize that there's a difference there. So I think what you'll, and I'll just basically say is that I think the embedded system is going to have a real challenge to innovate their way out of the problem that they got themselves, or that they're getting themselves into. And I think some of them are recognizing them, and you'll know some of the companies which are actually starting to be innovative and trying to explore in the space, and some of them are just ignoring the problem. Nick, what do you?
Well, just on the specific dirty generator coming out of capacity markets, I'm less worried than most people. I mean, actually, if you run a capacity market and the people who bid into it are the people who can provide the cheapest capacity, that shouldn't be a surprise, right? And the fact anybody who's worked out the cost of a diesel engine compared to a CCGT shouldn't be surprised we get lots of diesel engines out of it. If you think diesel engines are dirty and are bad for air quality, use your air quality regulations. Don't try double guessing your capacity market. Just doesn't seem a sensible thing to do. If it's not acceptable, it's not acceptable. Do it for the right reason.
A couple of consumer-related questions in the UK. You talked about 10p a kilowatt hour for large-scale solar. When do you think it's going to be, economically rational, aside from tariffs, for UK consumers to keep installing solar panels on their properties, if ever? And kind of likewise, is there anything that UK consumers should be doing at the $100, I think, per kilowatt hour battery price that you quoted, now, or when might it be economically rational for them to do so? And if I could ask a second question, it's kind of the electricity price, when you look at it, it's got so many of these kind of externalities that you talked about of, capacity markets and whatever else. How do you see the electricity price moving as economically going forward?
Okay, so let me pick up some of the early ones. So at 10p a kilowatt hour, you now, as a consumer, it's cost effective for you to do that. Because the best prices you can get is probably 13, 14p a kilowatt hour. So why wouldn't you? Because that's that one. Batteries, I think I agree earlier on, is that I think vehicles are going to be the early, at least in this country, electric vehicles, as they start to play a bigger role, I think they're going to be the forerunners of where we're starting to see large amounts of battery storage coming into the grid. I think that will transition as battery technology gets cheaper. Just on the $100 a kilowatt hour, we said that's where it's going to tend towards in the next 5 years or so. At the moment, we're still at the $200, so it's going to take a while to get there. I think when it gets to $100, then it's going to be a no-brainer not to do it.
So the easy answer is to what will the price of electricity be is that there won't be a single price of electricity. I mean, that's the nature of the sort of systems we're talking about, is that electricity is going to cost different amounts in different places at different times, from very low, when the sun's shining and demand's low, to potentially extremely high if we're using electricity for heating. And there's some very uncomfortable political issues in that, so that politics and governance systems may want to smooth that out. I expect they will, actually. I can't see us living in a world where it costs an old lady, £1 a kilowatt hour to heat her house in winter. I can see, you can imagine the press headlines already, but that's what the cost might be. Yeah.
I mean, one of the interesting questions is, in 10 years' time, will we actually be paying for kilowatt hours?
Yeah.
Or will we be paying for a capacity of kilowatts we could take?
Yeah.
That's one of the interesting questions that I think that's going to be going forward.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions. And before we thank Malcolm and Nick, I just want to tell you about 3 events quickly that are coming up. So we've got 2 more in this series. So next Thursday, we've got the Human Factor Collective Responsibility for Infectious Diseases with Mark Harrison and Hannah Maslin. And then we've got the panel discussion on the 26th of May, which is someone from each of the last 4 seminars. They will come and talk about the collective responsibility in everything that we've talked about before. So it should be very interesting. And finally, one that's very relevant for today,
Daniel Cameron is coming to talk about the clean energy revolution, science and policy here on Tuesday at 5 o'clock when there's a drinks reception as well. And so that should be very good. So it just leaves me to thank Malcolm and Nick for a terrific talk. Thank you.